Hello, my name is John Snyder. Welcome to our show today. Our guest is Dr. Kenneth Keulman, Professor of Social Ethics and International Politics, and he is also an associate at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. Welcome, Professor Keulman.
Sure, good to be here.
Professor, is there a connection between ethics and international politics?
Well, I guess the fact that you asked that question means that you have some doubts about it.
I do.
Many people do. And I guess that's why I constantly have to justify a very old tradition, which is that from the time of the Greeks, in fact, in the Peloponnesian Wars, the question was always asked about the morality of what they called foreign policy, what we would call it today. And I strongly believe there is. Many people disagree. Henry Kissinger, for instance, at one point in his career said there was absolutely no connection between international affairs and ethics. Later he changed that a bit and finessed it somewhat. But I think today, if we look at the world, the international scene, we would have that question almost any day. You pick up the New York Times or watch CNN. I think it's important that there are moral principles somewhere along the continuum of foreign policy decision-making for a lot of reasons. I mean, as an end in itself, I think morality is important in itself in our tradition, in our country. And secondly, because the way the world views our country, or any nation, for instance, if it acts immorally or fails to act in an ethical way consistently in foreign policy, that has an effect on the outcomes of a lot of international events, diplomatic conferences, and so forth. For instance, in the former Soviet Union didn't have a very high reputation for integrity in its public statements and so forth. In fact, when Soviets read Pravda, which means truth in Russian, they, especially the intellectuals, they had to parse that because they knew it was really lies. So they had to find the truth when they were reading it. And that kind of extrapolated into the international arena. Many countries did not really trust the Soviets to keep their agreements, including the United States with Reagan and other presidents. We were very apprehensive. And so the Soviets lost a lot of credibility in that realm. Now, just to kind of turn it around, U.S. first strike policy with nuclear weapons, for instance, is something that a lot of people aren't aware of. But it is a first strike policy. We don't have simply a defensive posture with the ownership and control of nuclear weapons. It's to be first strike. The Soviets in the Cold War had a policy of defensive use of nuclear weapons. They said many times publicly they would never use nuclear weapons other than defensively. And so they got a lot of PR points on that. Did anyone believe them? No. I mean, our country didn't believe them. That's why there was, of course, an arms race, one of many reasons. So while they may not have believed the rhetoric was important as something they were meant to measure up to. And on the other hand, our rhetoric, which is in the congressional record, is that we will use nuclear weapons first strike. This is long before George Bush's preemptive war doctrine. You know, this is during the Cold War years. So I think the short answer to your question is that there's an intrinsically valuable point for moral foreign policy to be upheld, and also as a strategic kind of way of conducting foreign policy that the United States, particularly in our case today, is regarded still by many people according to whether or not it keeps its own constitutional principles, civil rights, democracy, and so forth. And to the extent that it doesn't, our reputation plummets. And it has been plummeting since September 11th. I mean, that's no news to anyone. You know, I spend summers in Belgium teaching in our program there, and I've seen marked differences just in the reactions of students and others toward Americans there. Right?
So how far can a country go to protect its citizens in the context of constitutional and moral principles?
Right, that's the crucial question. You know, many people, particularly on the political right, are traditionally conservative, but not only them, would say that there are really no limits. The most important issue is the survival of the nation. So all bets are off the table. You know, that would mean a coercive interrogation, torture. It means rendition. It means invasive wiretapping. It means anything that keeps its citizens safe. But historically, it's very interesting that Benjamin Franklin, for instance, once said that any country that repeatedly violates its own intrinsic principles, meaning constitutional and moral principles, to secure its own existence, in the end, doesn't deserve to exist. Now, that doesn't deserve to continue on, in the international or national realm if it continually violates its own most sacred principles. That was Franklin.
So you would argue that we do have these moral principles and that they are being violated in today's climate?
Well, I think yeah, we've all seen. I mean, Congress has been investigating what we would call violation of legal and moral principles, constitutional principles, and how you separate out moral principles from constitutional legal principles isn't always very easy, since we're part of the Judeo-Christian legal system. A lot of our laws are founded on religious principles. For instance, like toleration. It seems like a very secular concept, but tolerance really stems from religious issues that developed in England centuries ago, and even that has its roots in the Hebrew Bible. So a lot of what we consider to be very secular legal principles have roots in a religious tradition, in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Can you give me an example of how our moral principles would affect our foreign policy if we chose to apply them to our foreign policy?
Sure. Well, I think, just say up to and during and now after the invasion of Iraq. Why is it that our reputation has plummeted in the world? And part of that, people say it's because they no longer believe that we're going to honor our commitments, what we say, what we do. We have a double standard. Now, those are moral issues. I think that the reasons that were given, weapons of mass destruction and so forth, now have been proven to be patently false. In Bob Woodward's last book, he had access to everyone in the Bush administration. It turns out that the run-up to the war started right after George Bush's inauguration, or soon afterwards. So already the agenda was being set. But the people were told, now it's what we've discovered, these weapons of mass destruction, how dangerous Saddam is, so forth. Well, Saddam Hussein was really being contained by brutal sanctions, since the first Gulf War. And of course, who suffered through most of those sanctions? Poorest people in the country. Mothers trying to nurse children couldn't get even powdered milk. Supplies, those sanctions were brutal. But, if you just take a kind of political realism perspective, they were effectively containing him. So I think, that would be an instance where our moral credibility has dipped because, well, it's a question of truth-telling and, what an administration tells its citizens, what's going on behind closed doors and so forth. Now, again, there's a case to be made. Not everything can be divulged before major foreign policy decisions are made. And again, Henry Kissinger was a master of this. He would always use raison d'etat, reasons of state. We cannot divulge this, like the secret bombing of Cambodia. Well, that's when it backfired. On Kissinger and the Nixon administration, they used that rationale once too often. And I think this administration continues to use that. It's an administration that seems obsessed with secrecy, with privacy, the kind of privatization of, well, of course, Bush ran on one of his elements of his plank was to privatize Social Security. Of course, that didn't go anywhere. But we see now we're privatizing the war in Iraq with Blackwater and so forth. And that's leading to, extremely negative results. We have a general there who's trying to win the trust, the saying hearts and minds of the Iraqi people, while Blackwater, is apparently operating counterproductively if the hearings in Congress say anything demonstrably true from the last 2 days.
Wouldn't President Bush argue that the moral principle that's guiding his actions is to bring democracy to the Middle East, and that would be an overriding concern, and therefore the ends would justify the means?
Well, yes, but I think very few people would accept that today, again, especially after Woodward's book. that whole notion is totally like the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. You can't bring a Western-style democracy, not overnight and maybe not over many years, to a tribal country. You know, when you have three major tribal divisions, Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds, which all have their own traditions, all have their own ways of self-governance. You can't simply inject a Western-style democracy, even a basic communal participatory democracy in a country like that, which has so many divisions. Now, we can say, well, Paul Wolfowitz, of course, is one of the architects of that policy. He was a political scientist. He knew something about all this. But they totally misjudged, certainly the nature of Iraq, if they ever really understood it very well. And I think it, it sounds like a noble purpose. But if it were true, why don't we try bringing democracy to North Korea tomorrow, or to Iran, or to Myanmar, Burma? Now, why are we so selective in the countries we choose? Now, if you've seen the recent memo of the former head of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, he said in an interview, and I guess he says in the book, although he's tried to backpedal a bit on this, that a lot of it was about oil. He said that was a no-brainer. Well, since he's kind of toned that down a bit, well, yeah, that's the first thing everyone would think of. I don't think it was totally about oil. I think it was mainly about the United States trying to establish a strategic position in the Middle East, which it's wanted to do for years. Now it has that, and it'll have to maintain a presence in Iraq to keep that. But I think it's basically about that, not so much democratizing Iraq. I don't think many people would accept that today.
Would you argue that our respect for human life and the individuality and importance of every person is at odds with our actions in this war in Iraq?
I think generally that's what's coming out, and I think that's why most Americans are starting to turn on the war. You know, when innocent Iraqis, civilians, as in this Blackwater case recently, are being killed. In the Blackwater case, it seems to be that they fired first in pretty much almost every documented case. Although Eric Prince, the head of the group, seems to said that defensively, the record doesn't seem to bear that out from what I've seen of it. Yeah, I've seen interviews, for instance, with a woman who was waiting for a cab, and it turns out the cab driver was shot by troops because he failed to stop when they told him to stop his cab. Now, maybe he didn't hear, maybe he didn't understand, the Arabic that was being used, I don't know, but he was killed, and it caused a real incident in the city. People came running out, and they finally went to this woman, and she was waiting for a cab to take her to a doctor. Now, well, these are repeated consistently. And I think that the military ordinarily is obviously willing to accept, civilian casualties in any war. In this war, the civilian casualties have far outweighed anything that anyone could have predicted. So I think it's rebounding. And General Petraeus said the same thing during his congressional testimony. He was very concerned, and he realized this was an issue, obviously for Iraqis first of all, but one reason why Americans also are turning against it, and because exactly for the reasons you mentioned.
Haven't we actually truncated our own individual freedoms as a result of the legislation and the activities since 9/11? Why are we giving up these principles so easily?
Good question. I think, first of all, I would say that I'm not like a total libertarian. I don't think that we should have full exercise of all civil liberties in the kind of situation we live in now. I think that would be unrealistic. I think that would be kind of Disneyland world, I think that would be to live in a state of denial. So I'm definitely not a total libertarian in that regard. I do think that, since September 11th, it did prove, especially in the immediate aftermath, necessary to curtail certain civil liberties. I certainly support that, but I think it's gone too far. And the Patriot Act, as we all know, was delivered from, maybe it's a Washington urban legend, but everything I've heard was that it was delivered the night before to congressmen and congresswomen for them to to judge to pass on the next day, and they did. Everyone did. I believe it was almost unanimous. But they hadn't read it. I mean, I saw an interview with John Conyers. He said, I didn't read it. And he's certainly a liberal if anyone is in Congress. He said most Congress people couldn't possibly have read it during that time span, and we don't ordinarily read every bill. Anyway, we have aids and assistance to summarize for us. Totally understandable. So I think we're on a slippery slope in terms of civil liberties, civil rights. I think it's gone too far, and I think the so-called war on terror, which I think is a misnomer in itself, is used as a justification for truncating certain liberties. So I always tell students in class, do you know that the FBI could go to the library here at this university and ask for records of what books you've been checking out? Well, suppose you're in a history course, European history, and you've checked out Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, and this shows up in the FBI. Very interesting. Students reading Lenin and Stalin and maybe Che Guevara or Fidel Castro. Well, I mean, that would be an obvious example. But do you want that? I mean, I know most librarians, university and public, have opposed this notion of the FBI being able to come and get records of students.
What about the attack on 9/11 would lead to that result? Why would that create the result of the FBI checking your reading habits? I don't follow that.
Well, if you were a potential terrorist, I mean, you could be certainly checking out materials on explosives. So, of course, a lot of that's on the internet. You may not have to go to a library to check it out. On organizing cells, for instance, say the history of organizing communist cells, maybe during the Cold War, or books about Al-Qaeda.
So the terrorist, so-called terrorist, would be going to the local library to check out books about Al-Qaeda, and then therefore we could track them down.
Well, I think it's that kind of scenario would be unlikely, but I think the thinking goes that someone who is inclined to engage in these actions is always searching for information on how to be more efficient or more deadly. And I mean, there are all kinds of manuals. So a lot of it's on the internet. Some's posted on the internet without the knowledge, for instance, of our security agencies. One was removed about 3-4 months ago, and a lot of people knew about it, but they didn't. I think that particular instance is far-fetched, but I think it's more people who might be potentially engaged in subversion or might be influenced by certain literatures to take a very negative viewpoint of U.S. foreign policy, for instance. You're constantly checking out Noam Chomsky's books. Well, a lot of people do, on all sides of the political spectrum, just to refute them or to have their opinions concerned. But if someone has, let's say, a record of books on communism, socialism, terrorism, they think this might be an obvious red flag. Now, I don't think it's a good place to look myself for security people. But
do you think that we have the moral obligation, the ethical obligation, to examine our past behavior that might have led to the situation that we're in? I guess what I'm trying to say is that if we call people if we think that terrorists are lurking behind every bush, wouldn't that justify every action taken since 9/11? Once you buy into that, aren't you buying into the other?
Sure. No, I think that's true. I remember right after the tragedy of September 11th, 1 or 2 people in Congress publicly asked the question, why did this happen? Why do they hate us? And the response from the White House was, anyone who even asks this question is verging on being a traitor, being anti-patriotic. I mean, Vice President Cheney said this. You don't ask that question. I mean, it's obvious they hate us. And George Bush said later, I think it was the day afterwards, they hate us because of our freedoms. They hate us because of our way of life. Well, I think that's incredibly simplistic. And afterwards, many people in Congress started writing this question, posing this question. And in fact, I used the book, one of my public policy courses, from the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the mainstream public foreign policy institution in the United States. People from government have been parts of it, are still part of it. It's a revolving door a bipartisan revolving door for service in State Department, for instance. So Council on Foreign Relations is about as mainstream establishment as you can get. They published a book called Why Did This Happen? How Did This Happen? And it was written by maybe 23, 24 people, very respected foreign policy analysts. Well, to ask this question right after 9/11 was deemed traitorous, and now it's, of course. And I said to students, right after that happened, the people in Congress were being criticized for asking the question that, well, sorry, but in universities, what we're about is asking questions. You're supposed to question everything. So we will be asking the question, why did this happen? Why do they, quote, hate us? And I think, what you said is right on the money, that we have to look at U.S. foreign policy. To me, that's why this happens. If you notice, even bin Laden's last tape, as abhorrent as it was, as abhorrent as what he does as a person, he doesn't talk about shopping malls or capitalism or supercapitalism or hypercapitalism. He talks about the same things. U.S. foreign policy, support for Israel over against Palestinians. He talks about the U.S. presence in Saudi Arabia, their holy land. Doesn't talk much about our way of life, or it's our administration that talks about that, because they don't want to talk about foreign policy.
So they don't hate us; they hate our foreign policy.
Well, I think it's more, that it's much more that. But I mean, obviously, that this rebounds in that it's reflected off that Americans are making this foreign policy. Therefore, Americans are targets for a certain amount of antipathy or hatred. I think that's pretty clear. Not everyone, even bin Laden in this last tape made a distinction, but he did say, and you re-elected George Bush. Well, I mean, that's a question a lot of political analysts have. Given where the war in Iraq was at those elections, why did the American people re-elect George Bush, who initiated this war?
Would you argue that perhaps our past unethical foreign policy has contributed to the situation that we're in today?
Yes, I would say that. This last summer in Leuven, where we have a program, I had a Palestinian come in and speak to a class I was teaching on European foreign policy. And he was from Bethlehem, and he talked about what it's like, Palestinian Christian, living in that environment. And he said, I grew up seeing Black Hawk helicopters every day, and I know who pilots those, or where they're made, where they're from. How can I feel good about America? He said, I've lived in this country. He said, I really like it. I've lived in the United States. I come back. He was going to the United States on kind of a lecture tour afterwards. But he said, it's your government. He said, Palestinians growing up, seeing all these weaponry and so forth that come out of your country, it's very hard for them to distinguish that element of foreign policy, and what, for instance, the government says the rhetorical position is about how they want to broker a peace in the Middle East. So we look up and we only see one side of it. We don't feel that we're getting a fair deal from your country as Palestinians. I think many Palestinians feel that.
Do you think that it's ethical to see the world in terms of good versus evil, or black versus white, or any of these very distinct differences?
I think it's dangerous for people at the highest levels of government to start using that kind of language. I think it's very dangerous. We have a whole discourse of public policy, international law, and I think we should stick to that discourse. We should talk about international law. We should talk about the United Nations Charter, United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. We should talk about the Torture Convention. We should talk about the Geneva Convention, which the former Attorney General said was outmoded and antiquated. This is all we have. And I think it's very risky to start talking about evil. Well, Reagan, of course, talked about the evil empire. And George Bush's religious background leads him to speak in those terms. Now, I've talked to any number of European heads of state, like after a Bush talk, which they'd seen on television, and they just shake their heads. He says, "We never talk about religion, or certainly not my personal faith, if I have any. It's not in the deck, that we play in politics." He said, "I can never understand your politicians and even your presidents bringing their religious beliefs in." And for me, that's a healthy attitude in the public realm. Now, I think it's very risky to start using that language, to start demonizing, for instance. I really think that one of the reasons why, for instance, the president was very supportive of Israel's move, last summer, previous summer, in the Middle East and in Lebanon, was because he does have some affinity with this far-right religious view that Israel, and particularly Jerusalem, has to do with the second coming of Christ. It's important to preserve that in a kind of pristine way. And so they don't seem to care that much about Israelis or Judaism as a faith, but insofar as that particular part of it, that messianic version, connects with their beliefs about apocalypse, it's important. I really think that George Bush is influenced by that. I think it's very risky.
It does seem that way. Obviously, if you were to apply ethics to foreign policy, how would that manifest itself in today's climate? We get out of Iraq. How does that work?
Well, I think first, again, I would use standards. Start with the standards of the United